Neil is administrator of the Maryland State Highway Administration. He's been there since January, in that position, January 2003. For that agency, he maintains and operates nearly 17,000 lane miles of roadway, 2,500 bridges, employs more than 3,200 professionals in a variety of disciplines, and an annual budget of $1.7 billion. He's a registered professional engineer, and he served in various capacities in that agency. And I don't know what Neil will say, but about 2.5 decades or so, quite a while, he's been there. He's an active member of various committees and is a native of Massachusetts. He holds 2 undergraduate degrees, and you can read about him in the profile. You want to read more about Neil. Neil, you come, please.
Thank you, John, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here this morning. I was struck, I walked in just as Laurie was starting to talk about going back to 1962 and the history of the environmental movement, and those in the environmental community becoming very good at learning how to say no. And we had a lot of that experience in Maryland, and we were not accomplishing a lot of things from a transportation mobility standpoint or from an environmental standpoint. And we recognized that we needed to change the dynamic of the relationship between the Department of Transportation, and particularly State Highway Administration, environmental regulators, and environmental advocates, and figure out a way that we could be creating a win-win solution. And I am convinced, and we'll talk some more about some of the approaches that we're taking on this, but that ultimately is the key if we're going to be able to achieve common objectives, objectives of both mobility and improvement to the environment, not just protection to the environment itself. And I think we're really on the cusp right now within the transportation community, as well as within the environmental community, of starting to understand, if we do look at this from a win-win perspective, how we truly can be making significant strides and improvements for the environment. And that's really the underlying theme and background in terms of what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to start with just the green infrastructure approach as it relates to transportation. I know most of you in this room are not transportation professionals, so I need to give you a little bit of context on that. What Maryland is doing from a green infrastructure assessment standpoint, so we'll talk a little bit about some of the tools that we're using in Maryland, specifically talking about US 301 case study. This is a highway project that we worked together with Chris and her colleagues at the Conservation Fund in taking a green infrastructure approach. And then I want to talk about a few tools that are under development at both the national and state level. And I'm going to go very, very quickly, just scratching the surface. So if you have questions, we certainly can be discussing them later. Recognizing that many of you do not have a transportation background, the key point that I want to be making with this slide is we really look at transportation from several different levels. We look at it from a systems perspective, a metropolitan area-wide perspective, a statewide perspective. Many of you who do get involved in transportation tend to get involved more at a project level. And we recognize that we have to be making decisions in transportation from the broadest regional perspective, from a quarter level, from an individual project perspective, and that we have to be thinking in terms of our intersection with the environment and how we not just impact the environment, but ultimately how we can be working together in trying to achieve environmental objectives at that regional or metropolitan level, at the quarter level, and at the project level. This is an evolution slide. Talks about going back to, now I didn't go back to 1962, I went back to 1970 and the National Environmental Policy Act here, but at the beginning, when we started to try to apply NEPA, transportation and environmental agencies in particular, we're having a hard time trying to figure out how do we work through and develop a process where we can figure out how transportation projects can go forward, environmental protection can be taking place, and there wasn't much of an intersection or interaction between the agencies in what I would call a positive collaborative manner. As individual pieces of legislation passed, we tended to get into individual resource areas, focus on individual resource areas. The transportation agencies recognized that they did have environmental compliance responsibilities, but under the laws and regulations, but took purely a compliance standpoint, what was the minimum that we could do to be able to get the approvals that we needed. And it really has only been within the last 10 years or so that I would say within the transportation community that we have started to recognize that we have a much broader environmental stewardship responsibility, that we need to be thinking about environmental systems, how we interact with environmental systems, as opposed to just localized impacts that we need to be trying to figure out how to mitigate, how we can be working more effectively together in partnership with environmental resource agencies and environmental advocacy groups in figuring out how we can be, as transportation agencies, helping to achieve environmental objectives as well. And finally now, in looking from a systems perspective at transportation and environmental systems together, looking at common objectives that we have, ways that we together can be trying to achieve the objectives that we want to from a sustainability standpoint, and taking a much longer term perspective and taking a much broader perspective from a system perspective as well. This will give you, and you'll be able to get this presentation after the conference is over, but it will give you some of the key milestones in terms of both statutes, regulations, executive orders, along that evolution that we've had over the last 40 years or so. So if I compare the way things used to be done with the way that we're evolving right now, transportation agencies used to focus on what is the transportation solution that we want to be proposing. We would then go in and look at what the impacts are associated with various alternatives, figure out ways to mitigate those impacts, usually at a very local level. And we would get reaction, whether it was from the community, from environmental resource agencies, from environmental groups. And it was very much a reaction mode, and often the reaction was not very positive at all. Now we recognize that we need to be looking from a much broader perspective, from a community perspective, from an environmental systems perspective, and a transportation perspective, and look at how we can be trying to integrate common goals and be developing solutions that are addressing goals across that full range as well. We recognize that we need to be working with stakeholders throughout the entire process and not be in a reaction mode, but have the stakeholders actually involved with us as we try to define what the transportation alternatives are that we're going to be trying to develop to solve problems, have the stakeholders involved in the definition of what the problem is that's being solved itself, and looking at what our common goals are that we can be trying to achieve from a community and environmental perspective as well. Now, from a green infrastructure standpoint, how can looking at things from a green infrastructure perspective help us in terms of this new way of addressing transportation? In particular, what tools can we be taking advantage of so that we can truly be looking at environmental systems and what we can be doing to be maximizing the benefits that we are spending our money on to try to help the environment. Transportation spends a lot of money on environmental mitigation. And one of the things that I was becoming very frustrated with as the head of a transportation agency was, are we really maximizing the value, the environmental value that we're getting for all of the money that's being spent on environment, and recognize that we really needed to be taking a different approach and not just looking at very localized impacts and localized mitigation for those impacts, but recognizing that almost every environmental resource that we were in some way impacting was part of a larger system. There were needs, significant needs in many cases, for those environmental resources, and there are ways that we could be doing much greater benefit for the environment if we were looking at what the needs were from a systems perspective as opposed to that very local perspective as well. But to be able to do that, we had to have the information to understand the environmental systems, to be understanding the significance of those environmental systems, and to be understanding where the needs and the gaps were in those environmental systems as well. So we have been working very closely with both our federal and state environmental resource partners, and I'll be talking about that in a little bit more detail, in terms of ensuring that we have the information available and enables us to take that systems perspective, and working with them throughout the development of our alternatives in thinking about the environmental systems that we are interacting with.